Resuming debate, the honourable member for Mont-Royal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to rise today in the House to support a very important motion which is both timely and one that deserves the attention of this House. McGill University next week on Monday, for the fifth time in 7 years, for the third time in 2 years, has a BDS motion in front of it. And Mr. Speaker, I want to talk to you because it comes a little bit from personal experience about the history of the Jews in Montreal and the experience of anti-Semitism in Montreal, because it ties to what is happening today with the BDS movement. There are students from McGill, my own alumnus where I went to law school, that contacted me last year and this weekend. Not only Jewish students, but Christian students, Hindu students, Buddhist students, Muslim students that are opposed to BDS. And they feel the hatred on campus that permeates. They feel the animosity that is generated by certain groups against them for no apparent reason other than the fact that they continue to oppose BDS on campus and are trying to lead the fight against it. You know, Mr. Speaker, the Jewish community in Montreal and in Quebec has a long history. In New France, Jews couldn't live in New France. You had to be a Catholic. And those Jews that tried to come there got sent back to France. But in 1760, with the British conquest, a Jewish community set up in Montreal. In 1768, the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue in my riding today was founded. And for a long period of time, there was a lot of harmony. Jews were amongst the founders of the Bank of Montreal, the founders of the Power Company, the founders of many of the institutions we today know in Montreal. Of course, there were issues. In 1807, they tried to stop Ezekiel Hart from taking his seat in the Quebec National Assembly because he wouldn't swear an oath on the true faith of a Christian. But by 1832, Louis-Joseph Papineau put forward a motion that was adopted by the Quebec National Assembly, the first place in the British Commonwealth that allowed Jews to be full citizens. And there was a period of harmony in the 19th century. The Jewish community was small. But in my great-grandparents' generation, Mr. Speaker, that started to change. In my great-grandparents' generation, the 1880s, the 1890s, 1910s, the massive Jewish immigration came from Eastern Europe and hit different Canadian cities, whether Montreal, Toronto, Winnipeg, rural communities. And the Jews became a third solitude between the English and the French. And at that point in time, when my great-grandparents were alive and living and becoming of age, Jews were under quota systems at McGill. They couldn't get in unless they had better marks, and that wasn't hidden, it was open. Jews weren't accepted into the large law firms in Montreal. The Jewish General Hospital was created because Jewish doctors and nurses were not allowed to practice in either English or French institutions in Montreal. So we created a hospital that is today one of the greatest ones in all of Quebec. But things then got even worse. In the 1930s, Canada's immigration policy, none is too many, under the King government, a liberal government, by the way, which I accept, was horrendous. We had one of the worst records of accepting Jewish immigrants from Europe at a time of crisis. We attended the Berlin Olympics, giving the Nazis a chance to showcase their wares to the world. And as my honorable colleague mentioned, when the St. Louis came up the coast and was refused by Cuba, refused by the United States, it was refused by Canada. And people were sent back to Europe, and many of them perished in the Holocaust. And so, after the war, Canada started changing. In my grandparents' generation, anti-Semitism was less overt, but they had a house in Val-David, and right next door in St. Agathe, Mr. Speaker, there were signs saying no dogs or Jews allowed in this location. It's ironic, Mr. Speaker, that my colleague, the honorable member for Laurentides-Labelle, is a Jewish member representing that same district where no Jews or dogs was allowed in the 1940s and 1950s. And that, Mr. Speaker, heralds the change in Canada. As things evolved over time, things got better. When my parents were coming of age, overt anti-Semitism was gone. There still had not been a Jewish cabinet minister federally. There still had not been a Jewish justice of the Supreme Court of Canada. But anti-Semitism was confined to polite statements when they tried to apply to a golf course. Oh, well, our membership list is full. And then, Mr. Speaker, when I was coming of age, when I was at school in the 1990s, there was no anti-Semitism that I ever felt. I went to McGill campus, I was there for my 4 years of law school, and never once did I feel targeted, uncomfortable because of my faith or background. Today, unfortunately, because of BDS and Israel Apartheid Week, That is no longer the case for Jewish students and other students who support Israel on our campuses here in Canada. And that is something that is shameful, because every student in this country should feel safe when they go to school and go to campus. And so let's come to the principles of this so-called BDS movement, a movement that is justifying itself in saying that they're somehow going to stop us from doing business, exchanging with Israel, letting Israelis come to sporting events outside of Israel in the name of helping the Palestinians. In my opinion, Mr. Speaker, BDS in no way helps the Palestinians, in no way advances the peace process that all of us in this House believe is important, in no way advances a two-state solution, but is simply, as my learned mentor, who represented my writing before me, Erwin Kotler, said, is part of a new anti-Semitism that stigmatizes and vilifies Israel by holding it to a different standard than every other country in the entire world. And so let's go through why BDS is wrong. Number one, Mr. Speaker, BDS misinterprets history. BDS seems to allege that the entire fault of the Arab-Israeli conflict is because of Israel. There's no fault whatsoever on the other side. No condemnation at all. Well, Mr. Speaker, let me tell you something. In 1948, when the United Nations partitioned Palestine, and they said there's going to be a Jewish state and an Arab state, it wasn't the Jewish state that started a war, Mr. Speaker. The Jewish state was content to live side by side with its Arab neighbors. But all Arab countries ganged up and said, no, we're going to drive those Jews into the sea. And we ended up having a situation where Palestinians became refugees because they left a territory that was then going to be Israel because Arab states started a war. In 1967, Israel was attacked again. And the borders of Israel expanded, not because Israel was expansionist and seeking to grow its borders, but because it was again attacked by a grouping of Arab states. The same thing happened in 1973. Now, Israel is not blameless in this conflict, Mr. Speaker, and nobody should say that it is. And nor do I believe, Mr. Speaker, that everything that Israel does is right. But to allege, as BDS does, that all of the fault of the Arab-Israeli conflict is because of the state of Israel is a simple distortion of history. So for that reason, by itself, BDS is wrong, because BDS singles out Israel and does nothing about condemning all of those Arab states that started wars against Israel, or condemning the terrorist actions or atrocities perpetrated by Hamas, by Hezbollah, and by the Palestinian Authority leadership, nor do they even condemn the mass atrocities happening in Israel itself, with innocent Israelis being stabbed. Then, Mr. Speaker, the BDS movement as well is wrong, because if you look at the thrust of what the BDS movement is asking for, it's actually asking for the disappearance of the state of Israel. Israel is the only majority Jewish state in the world. Israel exists as a pluralistic state. People of all faiths and backgrounds live in Israel. And by the way, Mr. Speaker, they are open, free citizens of Israel. They have the right to vote in elections, be represented in parliament, be in the Supreme Court of Israel, represent Israel abroad. It's not only Jews that represent Israel's diplomatic force or Israel's parliament. And Israel has a free press and is a democracy, Mr. Speaker. But then you get to the fact that what is BDS asking for? It's saying that all Palestinian refugees have to have the right of return to what is today Israel, which would automatically, Mr. Speaker, create a situation where you would not have a two-state solution, you would have a one-state solution where Israel was not a majority Jewish state. So one of the three things that BDS is asking for is actually to make Israel disappear as a majority Jewish state, the only one in the whole entire world. And that is wrong, Mr. Speaker. Then why else is BDS wrong? Well, BDS, which again singles out Israel, is not looking at all of the countries in the world, all of those other countries that have egregious human rights violations. When these students come onto campus and they tell us that they want to pass boycott legislation against Israel, why are they, Mr. Speaker, not turning their attention to the state of Iran? The state of Iran, which last year executed more than 1,000 people. that has political prisoners in prison for all kinds of things where they don't agree with the state, that is sponsoring terrorist organizations like Hamas and Hezbollah abroad, that has declared that it wants to wipe out the state of Israel. Why aren't they condemning Saudi Arabia that doesn't even let women drive, that doesn't let women have any kind of rights? Why aren't they condemning Syria, where the Assad regime has killed killed thousands and actually displaced millions of its own people? What about China? What about North Korea? Not a word, Mr. Speaker, from the BDS movement about any of these other countries. Only Israel is condemned, holding it to a complete double standard. And as well, Mr. Speaker, I've been to many meetings where BDS has talked, and they say, well, Israel should be held to a higher standard. We don't think it's like those other Arab countries. Israel should be a higher standard. Well, no, Mr. Speaker, that is the new form of anti-Semitism, because the whole idea of making Israel be held to a higher moral standard than anyone else is clearly anti-Semitic. And so, Mr. Speaker, again, I want to clarify there is absolutely nothing wrong with disagreeing with a policy position of the State of Israel, with disagreeing with the Israeli government, with disagreeing about expansion of settlements even. But what is wrong is where you say we're going to boycott this one country. We're going to tell academics from this one country they can't come to our universities. We're going to tell athletes from this one country that they can't compete in our sporting competitions. No matter what, Mr. Speaker, is their political views. There could be Israelis, there are many Israelis in a free country that may agree with many of the themes of helping Palestinians and wanting a Palestinian state and doing things to advance that cause. But the BDS movement is seeking to have us block those people also from attending international conferences. It's a ludicrous double standard against the State of Israel, Mr. Speaker. And then I turn to the question of, why would it help Canada? Canada's trade with Israel, Mr. Speaker, and the free trade agreement that was put in place originally in the 90s was expanded by the previous government and hopefully will be expanded even further by this government, is good for Canada. Israel is a good trading partner. It is a sea of innovation in the Middle East. It's a country that if you take Silicon Valley and you transplanted it to the Middle East, you would get Israel. Intel is there, Dell is there, Hewlett-Packard is there. The company Dialogic that I used to work for is there. And having had the experience of working with Israel and in Israel, I know that this is a country of innovation, a country where Canada as a trading partner will advance our own interests by continuing to partner with Israel. What else is bad about BDS, Mr. Speaker? Well, let's look at what it's drawing attention away from. Right now, you have all kinds of human rights abuses in the world. You have slavery going on in Mauritania. But BDS focuses our students' attention away from political prisoners that are being held in all kinds of countries in the world, in North Korea, in Mauritania, in Venezuela, and focuses attention only on Israel. So when the world has only a small amount of time to capture issues, to learn about issues, BDS is taking our focus away from where it's the most important to where it is the least important, because it's a country that actually does have a Supreme Court and a court system and a government that respects and upholds human rights. And then, Mr. Speaker, does it help Palestinians? Well, what would BDS impact the Palestinians that are in the West Bank right now? And also, how would it impact Arab communities living within Israel? The essence goal of BDS, Mr. Speaker, is to harm the Israeli economy, to tell businesses to displace. If you don't invest there, Mr. Speaker, you're telling businesses to move. So in the end, if you're telling businesses to move out of Israel, how does this help Palestinian workers working for factories in the West Bank? How does it help Arab Israelis? It doesn't, Mr. Speaker. It doesn't at all. And, Mr. Speaker, another issue is the BDS movement is never really going to achieve its goals. The goal to have the Israeli government somehow capitulate to what BDS is asking for is actually never going to happen. So it's counterproductive, Mr. Speaker. What we need to look at is how we can advance the peace process, how we advance a two-state solution where we are able to work together with our allies across the world to help Israel and Palestinians find peace. When you take one side, Mr. Speaker, and make that one side the only guilty party, the only aggressive party, the only party you're blaming, and you say to the other side, you've done nothing wrong. You're the ones that we're trying to help, and we're not passing any blame on you. You, Mr. Speaker, are getting into a very, very dicey situation. So, Mr. Speaker, comme un Canadien juif et comme un Québécois juif, et comme quelqu'un qui a sa famille ici depuis des générations, pour moi, je suis fier d'être capable de me lever dans cette chambre, de parler contre la BDS, de parler en faveur de motions. Parce que pour moi, Monsieur le Président, c'est un discours très canadien. C'est un discours que, pour la communauté de 400 000 Juifs au Canada, moi, je suis une des seules personnes qui a le droit de venir dans cette chambre, de parler contre quelqu'un qui blesse notre communauté. Et pour ça, Monsieur le Président, je suis très, très reconnaissant d'avoir cette opportunité. So, Mr. Speaker, I see that my time is closing because it's close to member statements. To conclude, I want to say that in December, I was lucky enough to attend the International Conference of Jewish Parliamentarians in Israel. And I was able to talk to about BDS with all of my colleagues from all over the world. And I was so lucky, Mr. Speaker, and I felt so lucky to live in a country, to come from a country like Canada, where BDS wasn't a question, where BDS was a movement that our government would condemn, that the opposition would condemn, that almost all parliamentarians would condemn. That's not the case in most countries, Mr. Speaker. So as a Jewish Canadian, I never felt more proud to be Canadian than being in that room and telling them in my country, we have almost unanimity that BDS is wrong. So, Mr. Speaker, I'll get to the free speech issue, but I believe I'm supposed to break it sometime, so I'm not sure when. I will break now. I will get back to the free speech issue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
For his remarks. Resuming debate, the honourable member for Mont-Royal.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the opportunity to resume. It is difficult sometimes to split a speech in two, but fortunately, I think if I had not convinced everyone in this House that BDS is a bad thing by the time we started member statements, then I have failed in my mission. So for the balance of my time, Mr. Speaker, I would like to explain why this motion is not a violation of freedom of expression. I would like to convince those members on that side of the House that they should join with us in the government and in the official opposition in supporting this motion, because what is not being asked is to ban free speech. The motion reads that we call upon the government that the House reject the BDS movement, which promotes the demonization and delegitimization of the State of Israel, and calls upon the government to condemn any and all attempts by Canadian organizations, groups, or individuals to promote the BDS movement both here at home and abroad. It does not say, Mr. Speaker, that we're not allowing people to have freedom of speech. It is not saying, Mr. Speaker, that we're putting this in the criminal code and throwing people into prison because they promote BDS. It is not saying, Mr. Speaker, that we're not allowing people to go forward and promote their views. What it's saying, Mr. Speaker, is that the government will condemn those views that we should oppose, because BDS is a new form of anti-Semitism. I would ask the members of the NDP and the member for Saanich Gulf Islands to look at the resolution and to substitute the word anti-Semitism for the word BDS. And if you called upon the government to condemn any and all attempt by Canadian organizations, groups, or individuals to promote anti-Semitism, both here at home and abroad, would you not vote in favor of this resolution? BDS is clearly singling out Israel. It is clearly a new form of anti-Semitism. We in the House have always condemned racism. We've always condemned xenophobia, and we condemn those who promote it. It does not mean, Mr. Speaker, that everyone who supports the BDS movement is an anti-Semite, but the movement in itself is anti-Semitic. And in the end result, that's what it does. It makes Jewish and pro-Israel students feel uncomfortable on Canadian campuses. It makes people feel uncomfortable to go to school. And that's not right. So, in the end result, I would ask those people who are opposed to BDS to support the motion and not say we're not doing so because it's a violation of freedom of expression. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.